all for coming. It's great to see so many faces here. I'm Dr. Esther Godfrey. I'm the director of the Preface program here at USC Upstate. This is the first event in our series. We have 10, 11 more events in our series, so I hope to see many of your faces at those other events throughout the course of the semester. But with no further ado, so we can have the most possible time to hear from Ron Rash, I'm going to turn this over to our Chancellor.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the work you do and all the efforts that I've enjoyed. Each of the authors that, and mine, I guess this is my third year being here at USC Upstate. I had the opportunity to come in early on today when we had students from District 5 that was here, and the room was full, and it was an amazing, amazing event. So I'm sure students, you're going to have the same type of experience. So Dr. Godfrey, thank you very much for your leadership and service to the first year reading program. It is my pleasure to welcome Ron Rash to the USC Upstate campus. Rash is a Western Carolina University John Parrish Distinguished Professor of the Appalachian Cultural Studies, that's a mouthful, and the Department of English. His work reflects the cultural tradition of Southern Appalachia, but also deals with contemporary issues and ideas that transcend the region. His first novel, One Foot in Eden, represents the aim of Preface very well as it deals with complex issues in our communities, the nation, and the world. Over the past 25 years, Rash has written several novels, 7 books of short stories, 6 books of poems, 2 anthologies, and a children's book. Janice Maslam of the New York Times considered him one of the great American authors at work today. Rash ties between the Carolinas run deep. He grew up in Bowling Springs, North Carolina, but his parents, James and Sue Rash, met in the early 1950s while working at a cotton mill in Chester, South Carolina. Both parents went back to school as adults in order to give their children opportunities they never had. Rash's father went on to teach visual arts at what is now Gardner-Webb University. Rash didn't attempt any serious writing until he was an undergraduate English major at Gardner-Webb. Encouraged by an attentive professor, like Dr. Godfrey, he drafted his first short story, Turtle Meat, about a man who used a snapping turtle to find the corpse of people who had drowned. The story won a $50 prize in the county writing contest, which inspired him to write more stories and try new forms. He has received the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award, Sherwood Anderson Prize, 2 O. Henry Prizes, and a Guggenheim Fellowship, among almost 20 other awards and distinctions. Please help me to welcome Ron Rash to USC Upstate.
You may have guessed that when I was a young man, I read a lot of Edgar Allan Poe to come up with a snapping turtle finding bodies in the Broad River. So, but it's so good to be here, and I mean that. I want to thank Esther, who's been kind of keeping this all together. Writers, dealing with writers, bringing them to campus is like herding cats. They just kind of wander off, but she's kept me on the course. And I wanted to do several things tonight. I wanted to read, and I thought what I'd do is, y'all are going to be my guinea pig tonight, because I've got a new novel coming out next week. It's going to be published September 25th, my birthday. And I'm going to read the opening section. It's about 8 pages. And then we'll move on and talk more about One Foot in Eden. But there are some parallels. I know that sometime this semester someone's going to come in and talk about veterans and the trauma that sometimes war can deal with. This new book called The Caretaker is also set in 1950s, actually 1951. It does deal with the Korean War. One of my relatives, older relatives, was in Korea, and he was a Marine, and he was fighting there, and he would, he told me stories about that, and he used a phrase that I've never forgotten. He was telling about some of the fighting, and he said, and then the fighting got thick. And that was where it really got really close contact. He lived, came back to North Carolina, Western North Carolina, and is still alive. But those stories left a real impact on me. And I was also thinking, what is it that makes me kind of want to write not only one book, but two books about this time, 1950 and 1951. And as I was working on this new book, it struck me that part of it is that it was about the last time where almost all of our communication was face-to-face. Now, so much of it is through screens, and that's a different experience. And I think in some ways, the face-to-face maybe is a little more dramatic because you're actually, you're actually directly in contact with people. You don't have the distance. So I thought I'd start off, and this book meant a lot to me in several ways. I was talking to a student earlier who knows the area of. I've always wanted to set a novel on my grandparents' farm. It's between Blowing Rock and Boone, North Carolina, because that farm meant so much to me. And this is, I guess, my 8th novel. And I kept wanting to write a novel there, and it would not come. But finally, with this one, I was able to set a lot of the action on it, and actually a cemetery that was right above the family farm. But this is a scene that starts the book. It's about a young man who's about your age, who's been drafted and is now in Korea. He's got a young wife. His wife is still a teenager. She's 17 and with child, and he's missing her, and he's out on night duty. He's guarding a river. And one thing that Korea, sometimes people who think of Korea, they also think of Vietnam as those wars being very similar. But actually, and we think of Vietnam as being more tropical. But Korea was nothing like that. It's a brutally cold place. And that, in a sense, plays a role in this scene I'm going to read. Jacob was on guard duty, posted beside a river that separated the two armies. The night was colder than any he'd experienced back in Watauga County. This cold did more than seep into his skin. It encased fingers and feet in iron, made teeth rattle like glass about to break. No layering of wool and cotton beneath the pile-lined parka allayed it. For weeks, Jacob had kept waiting for the cold to lift. Now it was March. This place observed no calendar. The river was still frozen. Jacob envisioned ice all the way to the bottom. No current, fish stalled as if mounted. The river had a name, but Jacob didn't allow it to lodge in his memory. Since stepping onto the pier in Busan, his goal had been to forget, not remember. At Camp Polk, he'd heard all manner of stories about what awaited him in Korea. Much of it was horse crap. The North Koreans ate rats and snakes raw, could see in the dark like cats. But some stories were true, including how they would crawl into an outpost, slit a soldier's throat, then recede into the night. Even if you were on the opposite side of the river, they'd come across and kill only one man when they might have killed 3 or 4. They were leaving a message. We're saving you for the next time. Though the river was frozen, Jacob knew that didn't matter. 2 nights earlier, a North Korean had decapitated another unit's sentry, crawled over the ice to do it. Jacob scanned the flat, soundless snowscape before him. At least the moon was full tonight. A hunter's moon, they called it back home. It silvered the crystals atop the river. If not wary of an enemy's knife, Jacob would have taken time to marvel at such shimmering beauty. But even this small moment must be blocked. Jacob wanted Korea to be a house entered and then left, the door locked forever. He just had to survive. 12 days ago, for the first time, his unit had been in a fight. Albert, a Cajun from Louisiana, had been shot in the leg. The bullet shattered his kneecap, and the medic said he'd need a cane for the rest of his life. That was fine, Albert answered. He'd get home alive to his wife and children, finally be warm. Getting home was what mattered. According to Naomi's last letter, Dr. Egan said the baby would come in May. That thought was the talisman Jacob carried with him. He could not die. God or fate, something, destined him and Naomi to have a life together. How else to explain that evening 20 months ago in Blowing Rock? At the exact moment he passed the John Lucy Theater, Naomi, a complete stranger, had been standing beside the ticket booth, coin in hand. If he'd looked up at the marquee, or if a friend had called from farther up the sidewalk, Jacob would never have noticed her. She'd worn no earrings or bobby socks, no bright bows or bracelets like the other girls he knew. But the adornment was not needed. It would not distract from her smooth skin and face. But her prettiness was only part of what had held him there. As the others went inside, Naomi rubbed a dime between her index finger and thumb, looking at the poster and then at the dime as people walked past her without a worry about the price. So much in that instant had been set in motion, including a shared life that ensured Jacob's safe return. Even Naomi being in Blowing Rock that July evening was little short of a miracle. Naomi's brother-in-law just happened to buy a copy of the Nashville Tennessean and noticed the ad. Seasonal hotel maids needed. The Green Park Inn, Blowing Rock, North Carolina. Hadn't that been fate too? Many soldiers brought something from home to help protect themselves. A rabbit's foot, a lucky coin, a playing card. So why not a belief? Yet last week, Daughtery, despite 2 crucifixes and a matchbox filled with 4-leaf clovers, had stepped on a mine and been killed. So Jacob's eyes did not leave the frozen river, his ears listening for the rub of cloth on the ice, scraped fingernails. Most nights the wind howled across this hard country, but tonight a rare, disquieting silence. The rest of the unit was encamped 50 yards behind him, the chosacino trees muffling snores and dream mutterings. Did the North Koreans ever sleep? Perhaps all they did was wait until you did. Silence was palpable as the cold. Villagers believed the ghosts of dead Americans wandered these mountains. Guess when they called it? Most men laughed at the notion, but because of where he'd grown up, Jacob did not. He wished he could smoke, but the flare of a match, the glow of it, might end your life. For an hour, Jacob had barely moved. A slight shift of his rifle, a slow turn of the head, but nothing more. As Sergeant Abrams advised, his fingers searched for the pack of gum in the parka pocket until remembering he'd given it to a villager's child 2 days ago. Jacob again looked up. Only the moon, not a single star. He had the sensation that both armies had quietly withdrawn, leaving him alone beside the frozen river. Then, as if to signal otherwise, a movement on the opposite side of the ice. Jacob shifted his rifle, laid his gloved finger inside the trigger guard. He watched the far bank, the iced over shallows. Nothing moved. After hours of guard duty, a soldier easily imagined things. could even hallucinate. Wind became whispers, shadows thickened in the flesh. Jacob resettled his finger on the stock. On guard duty, the only thing worse than being alone was the fear that you weren't. Sentries had different ways to deal with that fear. What works for me is I tell myself, I'm not a man but a tree. My heart's inside the first ring in the truck's center, Sergeant Abrams had told him. If you stay rooted, they'll look straight at you and not only see, only a tree. They can walk right past, still not know. Jacob imagined his and Yomi's farmhouse encircling him. Beams and scaffolding first, then walls and floors and windows, roof and porch. Every nail and plank in its proper place. Jacob's eyes swept left to right. Back in North Carolina, he'd seen good-sized creeks clogged with ice, but never a whole river. As he'd written Naomi, he hadn't known what cold was until he'd come here, or loneliness. He thought again of their starting a family. Naomi wouldn't be 18 until May. Although her sister Lila had had her first child at 17, it still worried him. His parents could have helped. For a year after the elopement, he and Yomi had proven they could make a good life without support of the parents. They'd saved enough money that when Dr. Egan said Naomi should no longer be lifting heavy objects, they could afford for her to quit the hospital laundry. Then in December, with Naomi 4 months pregnant, the conscription notice came. Letting the M1 dangle in the crook of his right arm, Jacob clutched the Parker's hood tighter. He bared a gloved wrist to check his watch, found comfort in the second-hand slow but steady circling, the tick of passing time. A few minutes more and Murphy would replace it. It was mid-afternoon in North Carolina. He imagined Naomi in front of the fireplace, half a world away. As cold as he was, the enemy across the river was colder. Jacob had seen what their dead wore, the tan jacket with at most a sweater underneath. The jacket's material was as soft and pliable as the quilts that had covered Jacob on winter nights. He could see how some GIs believed the enemy tinctured themselves with quicklime and coal oil. How else to survive wearing so little? On the edge of Jacob's vision, shadow shifted. He thumbed the rifle's safety, slowly turned his head. From the darkness, a form lunged, a knife blade tearing through Jacob's parka, the tip breaking his rib cage. He grabbed the man's arm, dropping the M1 as they fell to the ground, Jacob rolling on top. He reached out, felt his rifle's barrel, and grasped it, only then realizing he hadn't fixed the bayonet. As Jacob's hand found the stock and then the trigger guard, the enemy soldier clasped Jacob's waist. They tumbled off the bank and onto the ice. Did not break, and the landing knocked them apart. The M1 slipped free and skittered out of reach. The North Korean wore only a sweater and pants. He was shorter than Jacob, but square-shouldered like a wrestler. His hand still gripped the knife. Both men panted, each whisper, each breath whitening the air between them. Once their breathing steadied, they listened. Both banks were silent. Jacob jerked off his gloves, pulled the bayonet from the scabbard. Neither man tried to stand. They crawled closer, stabbing at each other, but the ice allowed little force in their thrust. Jacob's even less so because of the parka. Then the other man crouched and sprang forward. His knife blade glanced Jacob's neck, drew blood. The North Korean's free hand slipped and he fell face first, rising to his knees as Jacob's bayonet slashed his left cheek from ear to mouth, molars glinting white where the skin flapped open. One hand on the ice for balance, they swiped and jabbed, everything slow and unrelenting as a nightmare. Again, they came together, arms entangled as they rolled onto their sides. Mid-river, they broke apart, each gasping for breath, each knowing a shout would bring fire from both sides. On their knees, less than a yard apart, they saw each other clearly. The bright moon stage lighting their struggle. The man's hair was long for a soldier's, and he had to sweep it from his face. Dark smears marked their path across the ice. Most of the blood was Jacob's. The blood on the left hand had frozen, sealing the fingers together. Jacob flexed and unflexed a fist to free them. As the men watched each other, their breaths slowed. Jacob noticed a mole on the North Korean's chin, a bit of wool unraveling on his sweater. All seemed charged with significance. The soldier lunged, not to stab, but to knock Jacob off balance. Jacob fell and the ice crackled. The other man was on top now. Jacob raised his left arm and their forearms locked a moment before the Korean's blade raked Jacob's wrist. Another stab sent the knife into Jacob's left shoulder and his arm went limp as more ice fractured. Jacob felt a sudden distance from everything around him, even his own heaving breaths. The bayonet slipped out of his hand, whirled, and time unbuckled into a luminous vanishing. His body a bursting shell so easily shed. Let it all go. It won't hurt long. But he could not let go of Naomi. As the North Korean raised his knife, Jacob's right arm shoved the man off balance. The blade tip pierced the ice as Jacob twisted free. Inside the moon's circle of light, the soldier pried his knife from the ice, and Jacob picked up the bayonet. Almost ceremonially, they knelt before each other. Their breathing slowed, widening the silence. Rising into a crouch, the North Korean slipped, fell backward, his flexed elbows breaking the ice and plunging him into the river. Half submerged, but still wielding the knife, the man sought purchase, lifted one arm onto the ice, then the second. Jacob dropped his bayonet, crawled forward, and shoved the Korean under. When the head thrashed to the surface, Jacob, flat against the ice now, grabbed a fistful of hair and shoved harder, deeper. As he did, a spore of ice broke off beneath his right forearm. For a long moment, the arm, flexed rigid, hovered above the dark water. Time slowed more. Moonlight pressed against his back as if it too had weight. Jacob eased his arm back. Sternum pressed against the ice, he tried not to breathe, but the pounding of his heart could not be still. To be my heart that breaks it, Jacob thought, almost in wonder. The beating slowed, he tightened his stomach muscles, lifted his arms and chest off the ice, breathed. He placed his right hand beneath his stomach, pressed just hard enough to raise himself and balance the weight between hand and knees. He carefully turned, slid the bayonet into its scabbard, and eased his body onto firmer ice. Then Jacob heard a tick, and a second. He looked back, saw no movement. A third tick came, and Jacob realized that the sound came from downriver, and not on the ice, but beneath it. Then the knife blade broke through. It gleamed like a silver flame on the moonlight. Jacob waited until the blade remained motionless. Using his good arm for balance, he slid one knee forward, then the other, making his way toward shore inches at a time. For the first time, he was scared. Jacob could almost feel a rifle barrel steadying the aim on his back. He thought he heard a whisper from the opposite bank. Keep going, he told himself. They'll shoot whether you move or not. Jacob finally felt sand and pulled himself ashore. Someone whispered Jacob's name, then louder, more insistent. Murphy's voice, but it came from the opposite shore. So I'll leave him in pretty dire states. Yeah, he will actually have to spend the night, on the enemy side of the river before the next morning trying to get back. But that is another story. We came back to talk a little bit about 1 Foot in Eden. And this was really a book that kind of began when I taught at Tomasi-Salem High School. Some of you have ever been up to Jocassee Reservoir. Tomasi-Salem is right up there, only 4 or 5 miles from the reservoir. And I was teaching there, and I had a number of students whose families had been forced to move out of the valley. And so I would hear these stories about the families and what had happened. And I really got a sense of their story being important. I think sometimes what literature can do is to keep things from being forgotten. And so knowing something about that place and the people who had lived there, I began to write some poems about it. I've actually written a book called Raising the Dead, which is kind of a poetic version of this novel. But it came first, and I wanted to read just 2 poems from it because they kind of tie into what eventually became the novel. And the first one is a poem that really, I didn't realize it at the time, but as you read the novel, there's a moment in the novel where Amy suddenly feels almost as if a shadow has passed over her. It's a very brief moment. It's only about a sentence. But she has this eerie feeling. And that kind of came from this poem because in the poem, I kind of imagined someone being on that water and then the sense of those houses, because you can go there now, even today, and still see some of the houses. You can see the roads going in. It truly is kind of a haunted place because it's a very clear lake. You can really look down. And so I wrote this poem where I just kind of imagined being on that, on the reservoir, on the lake. And then I started to imagine a young woman, feeling something that passed over her. And it's like she senses what's coming. So this is called Under Jocassee. Maybe some of you want to try this sometime. Go out there and think about this. One summer morning when the sky is blue and deep at the middle of the lake, rent a boat and shadow Jocassee's western shoreline until you reach the cove that once was the Horse Pasture River. Now bow your head, and soon you'll see as through a mirror, not a river, but a road flowing underneath you. Follow that road into the deeper water where you'll pass a family graveyard, then a house and barn. All this changed as time. So cut the motor and drift back 60 years. And remember a woman who lived in that house. Remember an August morning as she walks from the barn, the milking done, a woman singing only to herself, no children yet, her husband distant in the field. Suddenly she shivers. Something dark has come over her, although no cloud shades the sun. She's no longer singing. She believes someone has crossed her grave, although she will go to her grave, a grave you've just passed over, wondering why she looked up. And just one more really short one. I did a lot of, a number of the stories I heard because I was living in that community. One of the most haunting was there was a man who had built his own house, every plank of it. And when, the valley people had to leave it, he was leaving this place that he built. His family had lived here for several generations. And before he left, just as the last possible time he could get in there before the water, he went with a can of kerosene and burned it down. And that has always haunted me, that he would do that. This is called a homestead on the horse pasture. Those last days, he stayed to watch water tug his farm under one row at a time. So slow his eyes snagged no memory of what was lost. No moment he could say, I saw it end. When little else showed but what his own hands had raised, he soaked house and barn with kerosene, shattered a lantern. As it burned, the taste of ashes filled his mouth until nothing remained but what he corbelled out of creek stone he would leave for the water to reclaim. So, having written all those poems, because it ended up being about 20 poems about Joe Cassidy, a time came when one morning I actually woke up and I was coming out of a dream, and I had an image that was coming out of the dream, and it was, and every novel I've written starts with a single image. And the image was of a man standing in his field. And I knew his crops were dying around him. And I knew that there was something going on with him more than just that. And so I started writing what I thought would be a short story, kind of trying to figure out what was the story behind this man. So that's kind of where I wanted to start. And I wrote about 15 pages. And all of this is from Billy's point of view, because the first voice I used or wrote was Billy's. And so I'll read just a little about this. But I started to realize that the story was getting longer. And since the longest story I'd ever written was 18 pages, and a vast majority of my recent writings had been poems of less than a page, I felt like a sprinter being asked to run a marathon. I ran an 800 meters in college and high school, but I suddenly kind of felt like I was going to the extremes. I didn't want to write a novel. I didn't even believe I could write a novel. All I knew was I had to try, because for some inexplicable reason, I owed it to that man in the field. Other characters soon rose up in my mind and announced themselves. First the farmer's wife, then the sheriff, and finally a son. And that was kind of one of the interesting things for me. I never plot out my novels. I never outline. They just come. And the more I write, the more mysterious it is. Where do these stories come from? I don't know. I mean, you could understand why I might start, very quickly. That image, I started to realize that this man is in Joe Cassidy's alley. That came pretty quickly. But I started writing, and I thought the novel was only going to be from Billy's point of view. And I was writing, and I was getting about 40 or 50 pages. And then it was almost as if Amy came, and almost like she kind of elbowed me and said, well, hold it. You're just hearing it from his point of view. This story is more complex than that. So I suddenly realized, well, I'm going to have two narrators. And so I started writing, with the idea that after I finished that first section with Billy, pretty much the way it is now, then I started Amy's section second, and to really explain what had happened with the murder. And then, as I was doing that, the sheriff became much more interesting to me. I started, even though he kind of came into the story incidentally, he started really intriguing me, because I had a sense that, I started to realize that this is a man who has a deep connection to this place, but he's also apart from it, and I thought bringing him into the story, I started to get a sense of who he was. And I also started to realize something else, that he was a very intelligent man. And I was going to have to take that into consideration. So those things began to happen. I started to realize the structure, and then I kind of felt like, well, the son needs a story, because I wanted to take the novel all the way to where the time when Joe Cassie is filled up. So I gave the son a version. Then I switched it. Okay, so Billy's, although Billy, I wrote that section first, I thought the sheriff would be the one to start the novel because he's from outside. And one kind of structural thing I was thinking about was it's almost, when you start with the sheriff, it's as if you enter that valley. You're kind of entering the valley with him, but you're also going deeper into to where these people are and into their lives. And at the very end, you'll notice the deputy kind of takes you out. So I thought that would be an interesting structure. And I just, I was starting to do drafts. I would add certain things that became more interesting to me as I got on. I started, characters such as Widow Glendower became interesting. My family's from western North Carolina, around Boone, but also around a small community near Asheville. And one thing that was always interesting was I heard a lot of folklore growing up. I had an uncle who had this premonition. He saw a fox and he thought it was his father come to talk, to convey something. And he truly believed that. And what was really interesting was, in a way, it kind of turned out the father had come for him, because my uncle died about 2 weeks later. And that kind of folklore, I'm fascinated with it. And so this book gave me a chance to deal with that. And another thing I wanted to do, and I think this was really important too. A lot of times when we think of Southerners or Appalachian, the language, that people think it's not sophisticated. Same thing's true of the Gullah. If you go to the coast of South Carolina, it's the same thing. This idea that these people maybe they're not that well educated, but I argue just the opposite. And in this novel, I hope to show some of that, because what I found growing up was that the language that my uncle, for instance, who had 8th grade education, a tobacco farmer, at times showed a real sophistication. And the way I wanted to convey that in the novel, I wanted to be true to the way these people speak. I mean, they would, use incorrect grammar very often. They would, one thing I grew up hearing, I think I was probably 15 before I realized, you ever heard somebody say, they, but using it like, somebody give me an example. You know what I'm talking about. You've heard that? Yeah, but you're not really saying they literally, but there's going to be fireworks tonight, and they're saying they, but you know what they mean. But I wanted to convey that, but also I wanted to convey what I think was the sophistication that you see very often in folk languages. And just one example that's always stayed with me, when I was about your age, I was probably 17 or 18, I was in Boone with my uncle, the one that was a tobacco farmer. And it was summertime, and this young, probably an Appalachian student, came walking up the sidewalk, and my uncle saw me looking at her. I told she was very attractive. And he turned to me and he said, "That girl hasn't got enough clothes on to wad a shotgun." Now, if you break that down, it's pretty brilliant. Because think about what you're doing there. You're taking two things that are very unalike: shotgun, clothing, and you're connecting those. And so I hope as you were reading the novel, you saw these characters using a lot of similes. Because I think that's, as I say, that was something that was important to me. I wanted to show that this language is sophisticated in its own way. Probably, though, one of the more interesting parts was originally in the novel, I thought that, well, actually I had Billy. Billy, once he killed Holland, I had to find a place for him to hide the body. And so I really thought a good bit about that. I thought about, maybe burn it, maybe, I'm the same guy whose first short story was about a snapping turtle finding bodies, so I'm obviously demented. But what I thought was, I came up with what I thought was a really good thing. I'm going to have him shoot his horse, but he's going to bury that, or put that body beneath the horse. And that way, even though the horse is it's decaying, so that, it's going to hide the odor of the body. And the sheriff won't realize that. But then I started to realize how smart the sheriff was, and that he'd figure that out. And then I had a real problem because how am I going to hide this body from this really good sheriff? And so what I did, and it was August, I remember this, I actually went out and looked out in my backyard into the woods. And the cicadas were revving up, and I was hearing all that. And I thought, okay, what am I going to do with that body? And I spent a couple of hours figuring, trying to think, okay, how can I hide this body from this guy? And you know where I put it in the end, which has kept a number of friends from going out into the woods with me on the night. But it's all kind of, it all became a kind of adventure for me to, and to have written it. This was my first novel. I'd written probably 40 or 50 short stories, but I think it, I feel proud of it. I think for one thing, just that I completed it, and I just wanted to read, 2 paragraphs from Billy's, because this is actually where I started, and actually this first line came to me. It really started the novel. It wasn't something I put in later. Pretty much the first paragraph. When deep summer comes and the dog star raises with the morning sun, the land can scab up and a man watches spring crop wrinkle brown like something on fire. It's the season snakes go blind, their eyeballs coat over like pearls and you get mean. A rattlesnake allows no warning, and a milk snake that would have cut the dust to the tall grass in June quills up and strikes at anything that steps its way. It's a time when foxes and dogs go mad. They'll come shackling toward you, their lips snarly and chins white with slobber. You'll raise your gun, they'll come on like they just want to get it done with. Sometimes that time of year, a man will act no different. A man who would any other time would step around trouble. A man who, if his truth be known, might be a bit of a coward, will of a sudden turn mean and crazy. He'll do something nobody, even himself, would reckon likely. He'll even kill a man. So I knew I had the voice there. I had at least one of the voices. And one thing I really had to do was I didn't want the voices all to sound alike. And so with Amy's voice, you may or may not have noticed this, but I used a lot more of imagery from the natural world with her, particularly plants and trees. Just a different way because these are 2 different people. The sheriff's language, of course, is more sophisticated. He's been educated. He's been to college. So I thought, all those things kind of came together. And one of the most interesting things about this book, which is set right here, probably 50 miles from Jocassee as we speak, not that far, is that the book has been translated now into a number of different languages. I've actually got at least one of my novels been published in 17 languages now, and it's kind of to me it's just kind of interesting. I'm writing about this little piece of our kind of local place, and yet the story seems to resonate. And I think the reason for that is that people, the culture may be different on the surface, but I hope that you felt like in a way that this novel was really about human beings with deep conflicts of the heart. And I was in Paris, France, about 8 years ago, and a woman came up to me when I was doing a book signing, a French woman, and she said, "You have told the story of my life." And I said, "Well, how? What do you mean?" And it had turned out that her father could not conceive a child, And the father and the mother decided that they would have a friend impregnate her, and she was the result. So, that story, actually certainly resonated with her. But I hope that you felt the characters were complex. I hope that you understood their motivations in some ways, even if you disagreed with it. For me, Amy's the most interesting character because I think she's being pulled on all sides in a really kind of exhausting way, and her choice. But ultimately, I just kind of hope you enjoyed the book. I mean, books can do a lot of things. I could talk to you about structure and language, but if they're not a pleasure to read, you failed. That you got to start there. You got to want to. You want your reader to turn the page. But I just kind of wanted to open it up, and I hope you'll have a few questions for me because most of you read the book, and you might have something, something you want me to explain a little farther. Or, yeah.
What happened to Janice?
We don't know. Janice, the sheriff's wife, she's kind of lived a disappointing life. And I think that, one of the saddest parts of the novel is that, the sheriff and his wife are almost a mirror of Billy and Amy, except I think the sheriff has a sense of estrangement that he can't connect it. At the end, we don't know. I would like to think that the sheriff and the son, the sheriff would kind of take him under his wing, in a way, maybe adopt him even, which I think would be believable. And you remember the sheriff had always wanted a child. And so, in a way, this is kind of a tragic book, a sad book. But I hope that felt a little bit of hope that this sheriff was going to look after the child, the son. Whether Janet will be fine with that or not, we don't know. But it's the sadness of life. You've probably seen people. I've seen people like that who've grown apart. Sometimes it's a matter of upbringing, disappointment, wanting more out of a relationship. So we don't know, but we can wish her well, right?
If you wrote the book today, what would you do different?
Oh wow! That's a great question. If you if I reread the book today, what would I do different? I have never reread one of my novels, and the reason I don't is because I know I would find so much that I should have done better. And it's funny. I got this new book called The Caretaker. I read that scene. I got it in the final copy about 2 weeks ago, and I opened it up and I looked at it and I said, "Wow, 6 years, and I finally got this book." That was my first thought. My second thought was, "Oh gosh, what did I miss?" I know there's something in there. And what's funny is that anytime you make a mistake, there's always someone who will write you and let you know. And sometimes they're wrong, but I've learned not to argue with them. I actually had in my novel, Serena, I had a woman in Texas write me because of the horse that I had this woman get what was supposed to be an exotic horse. It wasn't a horse that normally you would see in Western North Carolina. She wrote me a 5-page letter explaining to me that she was outraged that I'd done this. She ended it. Not only do you know nothing about horses, but you don't know anything about women either. Which may be true. I don't know. But it just, I've learned I never respond because they're usually insane. And this is all they've got to do. So I just, one time though, a guy did catch something, and it was a very small detail, but he was right. I just said, "You're right." Okay, and hit, respond. If I went back, I'm sure I would find places. It's interesting. when I was reading those few pages out of the new book, I saw something I wish I'd gotten better. And, I should have said this better. I should have made this clearer. It's I tend to do a lot of drafts. On this new novel, I probably did 20 drafts. Wrote over 1,000 pages. Book's only 255, but you just do the best you can. I remember Stephen King. One time I was watching him. I think it was a 60 Minutes and the interviewer was saying, "Well, what do you say when people criticize you, call you a hack and a terrible writer?" And Stephen King just kind of looked at the guy and said, "What do you say? I'm trying. I'm not deliberately trying to, enrage you by writing a bad book." I think King's answer is probably the best one. I'm trying. I'm sure this book's not perfect, but it's the best I can do. Yeah.
What was the image that inspired the book?
The image was of that. You mean the 1 foot deep? Yeah, it was the image of that man standing in the field, that farmer, because I could just see him, and there was just a look of desolation on his face. And if you really want to get into something, and this is what you do if you're a PhD, I actually kind of started to play off the idea of the Fisher King in mythology. So if you're curious, maybe Google Fisher King and see what comes up, because that's an old myth about where the crops die with the Fisher King, because the Fisher King's infertile. And so I'm playing off that in the novel. I'm doing, there are a lot of things that are going on. And I think the test for me of a good book is it gets better the second time you read it. That's when I think you find out how good a book is. Yes.
How did you decide, when to start and stop each character's point of view, and where to make them overlap and all that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that was one of the parts that was the hardest. The question was about, how did I know where to stop with one character's, like Billy's story, and go on to Amy's. And that was probably the hardest thing I had to do, where I was very consciously, because the problem is, if I had to really make sure I didn't start, just repeat the same story again. I had to find different aspects of it. And I spent probably more time on that than anything else, because I found that it was like I was pruning. I was finding a sentence, okay, I don't have to explain this to the reader. And that was a real challenge, because you are in some ways telling the same story 3 times. Yeah, good question. Yes?
When in the writing process were you inspired to add Janice's miscarriage?
That actually kind of came late, because the sheriff was the 3rd character. I'd already written Amy's part, and I started to realize, and this became much more conscious, that the sheriff is going to feel some deep connection to Billy. And I mean, enough to where at the end I think you sense he's just pretty much going to let this go. And so what I was trying to do was, I was almost setting up Janice and the sheriff as a kind of counter to Billy and Amy. But as I got deeper in the book, I thought, well, that would be kind of interesting to, someone who also hasn't been able to have a child, or because of a miscarriage. And, that can be really tough. I've had a couple of good friends who've gone through having, miscarriages, and it's a tough thing emotionally. And most times people can get through it, but sometimes it really, it changes things. I just became much more, I thought that would make the sheriff more empathetic, but also just kind of, it's almost like an echo. The characters echo each other, structurally. Why don't we do 2 more questions, and I think that,
When did you decide to add deputies over here?
I needed someone to take us out of the story, and I thought it would also be interesting to have, I don't know how you felt about Widow Glendower. I think you can take her several ways. One, she is a real witch. She has real powers. Or is it almost as if Billy and Amy are projecting their kind of inner darkness onto her, trying to blame her in a way almost? Because I hope I kind of left that vague. But if you really do your graduate work, you'll find that Glendower as a character is a wizard in Shakespeare, in Henry IV, and so I used that name. I was kind of playing off that. But just kind of just kind of going with that, thinking. Kind of where that lived. It's so so interesting thinking back about the book because it's been so long since I wrote it. Sometimes I forget certain passages. Let's do one more question and we'll. Yeah.
What inspired you to have Miss Winchester take yourself out?
That the second poem I read, where the man burned down his own house, I'd had that in my mind, and I felt like this. Mrs. Winchester, because she knows her son's body is somewhere in that place. That, in a sense, it was like she could not leave that place because she was going to have to leave. They were going to make her leave, and I thought it would be a way of also of showing her grief. That because this is never going to change. Well, I've enjoyed it. Y'all been a good audience, and I hope you enjoyed the book.